You have the boy's magic.
No, this magic belongs to no boy.
Of course, you can see why a story about a boy who never grows up might appeal to certain Hollywood executives. But if we discount the more sinister motives, what could possibly have possessed Disney, this Disney, not that magical kingdom you remember from when you were a kid, to bring Peter Pan back to the screen? It's a timeless classic rich with motifs, the beauty of childlike innocence, the necessary but painful sacrifice of growing up, the ultimately unfulfillable and unfulfilling nature of our desires after eternal youth. Being timeless, it's had a great many adaptations, most on the stage, but a fair few on the screen as well. The famous Disney cartoon from the 1950s, the rather less famous 2003 live-action adaptation, and the entirely unfamous Ben Zeitlin version from 2020 called Wendy. And if you'd never heard of that, you're in pretty good company. Besides which, a number of spin-offs of varying quality and relevance. Hook, Return to Neverland, Tinkerbell, and so on. So we've not exactly been short on Pan-related content over recent years, and the basic tale, as well as various interpretations of its consequences, have been done and redone and redone and redone. So what else is there to say? What do we accomplish by doing it again? Does anybody really think a live-action rework going straight to Disney Plus would perform better than, I don't know, just a straight re-release of the 1950s original? But this is 2023 and we are in the era of the remake. Disney is by no means the only company at it. HBO is bringing back Harry Potter a whopping 12 years after the last film's premiere, but it is undoubtedly the standard bearer. Disney's had various slogans over the years, but has latterly swapped "Where Dreams Come True" to "Let's do it again but worse." And it's burned through its back catalogue so quickly that it's now begun remaking its own originals from within the last decade. We've had Mulan, The Little Mermaid is eagerly not anticipated. We've had Maleficent, Jungle Book, Alice in Wonderland, Beauty and the Beast, Dumbo, Aladdin, The Lion King, Cruella, and Pinocchio within the last 9 years, so that's the back catalogue pretty much dispensed with. How about Moana then? Remember Moana? That's an old classic. Came out in 2016. Ancient history. Well past time to revisit it. None of this is necessarily objectionable. It's not as though Disney's recent originals have been particularly inspiring. Strange Worlds, anyone? The problem is, though, that the only need being met is the company's balance sheet. Remakes and reboots are fine if you've lit upon some new way of presenting or telling the story, some new interpretation that really adds to, or at any rate comes close to, the quality of the original. But go back over that list of Disney's recent remakes. How many of them meet that criteria? How many of them even manage to summon up the magic of the stories they're repeating? Did the live-action Lion King contain half the range of emotion of the animated original? And if not, and it didn't, did it compensate for that by adding something new to the telling? The answer is no again, by the way. The problem is not with remakes per se. Many of the old Disney animated classics were adaptations, reboots in different artistic mediums, and drawing on stories that were themselves innovative reimaginings of older tales. Peter Pan takes half his name and no small part of his character from gods of the Greek myths. Aladdin is lifted from an amendment to the 1001 Nights. Cinderella comes from thousands of ancient folk and fairy tales. The Jungle Book was given to us by Rudyard Kipling first, and so on. No, the problem is that while these original adaptations saw the artistic, cultural, even the magical value of the stories they were lifting, and made conscious attempts to distill that magic in new and delightful ways, the value modern Disney sees in these adaptations is material. Its recent failings are a good guide and predictor of future performance. Nobody involved seems particularly moved by the stories they're borrowing. Few seem even to understand them. And the impetus for their recreation isn't, "This ancient story is popular for a reason, let's understand the reason and reap the reward." No, it's rather more like, "This old show is really popular, everyone's heard of Peter Pan, right? Instant money, do it, now." It's a company-wide problem that is dangerously close to being a culture-wide problem, if it isn't one already. People will often glibly remark that they keep doing these remakes because they can't write anything new, and it's true, but it's also symptomatic. Disney and others like it can't tell new stories for the same reason their adaptations fall increasingly flat. An illiterate grasp of history, an absence of moral imagination, and no understanding of or love for the craft and purpose of storytelling to begin with. A writer can write for no audience but himself, satisfying no love but his own, and it would cost him nothing but time. A screenwriter, on the other hand, is consumed by his studio's need of profit. and the incentive is all too often reduced to the cheapest way to capitalize on an old and sincere labor of love, which consequently carries none of the love and imposes all of the labor upon the suffering audience. All of this is on display in the latest soulless grift on Disney+, Peter Pan and Wendy, which is almost twice as long as the 1953 animated original and contains so little of its magic that I'm not even going to bother making up a fraction. Or, well, sod it contains 1/fuckth of the original's magic. There you go, have that. Now, I guess we'll have to get on with the plot. This won't be a complete and intensive breakdown, as I think the basic story of Peter Pan is tolerably well known. Rather, I'm going to chart the major beats and mark where and why this film decides to do things differently, and then note the results. It's also a bit of an unexpected video for me, and it's more strictly critical than comedically critical. I'm saving my ammunition for the next Mandalorian video. Overall, this is not the worst adaptation in the world, but it is a marked downgrade on its predecessors, and I think it's useful to understand why they work and this doesn't. To those who will inevitably say, "But it's just a kid's film," okay, fine. But so was this, and this is infinitely better. A hard divide between childhood and adulthood is contrary to J.M. Barrie's entire reason for writing Peter Pan to begin with. Try reading a book, you moose. We begin in the Darling household. The Darling brothers play acting a sword fight while Wendy packs for an upcoming trip to boarding school, from which she breaks to join in the sword fight, at which she is, naturally, very skilled already. Just like you'd expect of a girl in Victorian England, where in the 21st century imagination, every little girl was a budding Emmeline Pankhurst, and Emmeline Pankhurst was really no different from the boys, except that she was better at pretty much everything. The fight ends with a mirror getting smashed, and Wendy copping the blame for it. Her father kicks off what you would think would be the film's strong-armed theme, age versus fun. In the event, though the theme is present in the film, it's not really stressed, and you get the sense the writers didn't really have much to say about it. Wendy's told she is too old to be having this sort of fun. She has to set a better example to her brothers. There's rather a lot to say about this theme, but we will come back to it presently. The film needs to very quickly establish Wendy's role in the script, which is less subtle and artful than the role she occupied in the original. Her mother downright tells us that she's a leader, that the boys will follow her, so she needs to be a good leader, even though she's off to boarding school the next day, where she will, amongst other things, be rather hard to follow. Anyone who remembers the original will recall that the leaving the nursery aspect of that introduction is sort of metaphorical. She's not actually being taken away from the house. She's being taken out of the nursery where her brothers sleep. That's the symbolic growing that she's being forced to undertake, which is an altogether less messy way of introducing the problem than this. Darling mother tells her she needs to get ready for the life ahead of her, just as she once did, prompting Wendy to snap back that she doesn't want her mother's life, which ought really to have got her belted. Seen and not heard and all that. Her mother intuits that Wendy is afraid of growing up, which Wendy confirms, and this scene is reasonably done. Nothing special, but it does the job. Her mother sings her to sleep, which moves us swiftly along to Tinkerbell's nighttime visit, where the CG struggles rather to fit her into the world. They've taken the fairly cheap approach of blurring the background behind her, except in the distant shots, but that only really serves to make her look more uncanny than less, with a vast chasm between her foreground and the blurred background. For reasons unknown, she levitates Wendy, but one of the Darling brothers captures her, which occasions Peter Pan's first introduction, of which a couple of things to note. In the first place, and as will be quite well established later, young Alexander Maloney does not fit into that exceptionally small bracket of child actors who can actually act. And in the second place, his pronunciation of fairy sounds an awful lot like furry, meaning his first line is essentially,
"She is a fairy." And if I know one thing about fairies, it's that they don't take kindly to being called bugs.
She is a fairy, and fairies don't take kindly to being called bugs. Fair enough, my dude, but the cure to an infestation of fairies is the same as for an infestation of bugs. It's fumigation. Maloney isn't going to be singled out for criticism. The acting is quite consistently am-dram throughout the film, but he does deserve some singular criticism, as when you take the magic out of the performance of Peter Pan himself, you take an outsized share of it out of the film as a whole. A chunk of the problem here comes from the writing around him. In this telling, Peter Pan is a common myth in universe. The kids all reference him, the kids play act as him in our opening, and so his first appearance is denied much of the magic of surprise. He turns up and they instantly know who he is, with some minor shock at seeing what is already familiar, but with no wonder at his essential, existence, which when you compare it to the 2003 version, makes this telling pretty mundane by comparison. Guy everyone knows pays a visit is much less exciting as an introduction than Impossible Fairy Boy flies through a window. The setup is closer to the animated original, but without understanding what made that work. The 53 film's opening finds the magic in revealed truth because prior to Peter's arrival, the darling father is the designated rubbisher and representative of a fearful adulthood. He embodies the drudgery of real life, and he is the authority figure. His word is law. He scolds the children for playing make-believe, for believing in Peter Pan's existence. He threatens to take Wendy out of the nursery and to force her to grow up. He even disabuses the dog, Nanny, of its own childish myth that sees it act as a real nanny to the children.
Well, you're not really a nurse at all. You're, well, a dog. And the children aren't puppies. They're people. And sooner or later, Nana, people have to grow up.
So the kids play acting the story of Peter Pan doesn't detract from the surprise of his appearance in the 53 film, because his appearance essentially counts as a moral victory for the children. Having been told, no you can't, here, under the nose of the tyrannical parent, is the boy who proves that yes, you can. The father acts against imagination. Peter Pan's arrival is a victory for imagination, and so a victory for childhood. The wonder then isn't so much that Peter Pan exists as what he represents. So both the 1953 and the 2003 versions have their own ways of conveying magic, while the 2023 version doesn't as much. It seems a bit too familiar with its own mythos to really revel in the fun of it, or to understand and convey the joy children feel at realizing that their imagination is pretty much the limit. The distant and never realized threat of boarding school for Wendy doesn't come close to presenting the proximate threat of adulthood, as embodied in her father, or the otherworldliness and unknown possibilities that Peter represented in the 2003 film. Another chunk of the problem comes with dialogue, so again it's a fault of the writing and not of Maloney's delivery, lacking though that is. Compared once more with the 2003 adaptation, these characters have lines that by and large could be swapped between them. It's a banalized script versus the 2003 version, which clearly establishes character, belief and personality through dialogue, and quite efficiently. It doesn't only do it in an equivalent amount of time, but it does it in the equivalent scene.
You, Peter Pan?
Were you expecting someone else?
We weren't expecting anyone at all.
They always act so surprised.
There is a boy here who is to teach us to fly.
You offend reason, sir.
Jeremy Sumter's performance isn't leagues above Maloney's, but the script allows him to have more fun and to convey more fun, and for the kids around him to have more fun, which makes for a more vibrant and compelling introduction to all of these characters than we get in Peter Pan and Wendy. In fact, as far as her brothers are concerned, I'd go so far as to say that this introductory scene in the 2003 film establishes more character for the brothers than the entire 2023 film accomplishes. The plot itself hasn't yet deviated too much, so there's nothing especially remarkable about it thus far. Peter is introduced to the darling kids who help him catch his shadow, which here is mere nonsense, but which the 53 film used to tease Peter's imminent arrival.
You see, I found something that belongs to him.
Oh? And what's that?
His shadow.
The shadow in the original is evidence that the children are right in their beliefs before the audience sees that they are, which adds a little bit of mystery. Whereas in this film, Peter arrives in search of his shadow, a search that cannot make any sense to the children watching him conduct it because they have previously not encountered the shadow. Having found it and caught it, Wendy stitches it back onto him, accidentally pricking him with a needle and giving him a thimble for a kiss, and so on. In its essential beats, Peter Pan and Wendy is trying to remain faithful to source at this point, albeit only on the superficial level. This happened there, so something similar must happen here. In 53, Wendy says that Peter is taller than she'd imagined.
You know, you look exactly the way I thought you would. Oh, a little taller, perhaps, but then...
So in 2023, she says he's smaller than she envisioned.
Envisioned you as being...
Taller?
No, smaller, actually.
This Peter's outfit is clearly modelled on the 53 film too, whereas the 2003 film modelled it more closely on Barry's description of leaves and spiders' webs in the novelisation and the plays. But in other small but important details, the 2023 film is devoid of meaning. In 53, the children aren't especially surprised to see Peter. They are overjoyed, which is different. They're not surprised because they always believed, they knew he existed, as they do in this film. But also because they had previously found his shadow, which in this film they had not. Tinkerbell in this film has the first interaction with Wendy, while in the 53 film she is very much and resentfully a sidekick helping Peter on a mission, and her first real look at Wendy comes from her hiding place inside a locked box, which clearly establishes the divide and the distance between them that becomes so important later, foreshadowing the jealousy that she will have to overcome. Both films do something to establish Wendy's motherly instincts, but as will always be the case, 53 did it better. In this film, she's the swashbuckling renegade type who is essentially one of the boys, while in 53 she is with but not of the boys. She is partway to maturity already, as evidenced by her behaviour compared to theirs, but she's fearful of taking the next step. Her sewing Peter's shadow back on is of a piece with her general and pre-existing motherly instincts and behaviour, essentially fussing over him as she's already been shown fussing over her younger brothers. Her immaturity is the source of her imagination, her comparative maturity causes her different behaviour. Here, however, in 2023, she's not been shown with these qualities, and so, though she has the idea of sewing Peter's shadow back on, it isn't actually building off of anything we know about her as a person. What we know about her as a person is comparatively shallow, something the film considers to be exciting, an all-action, go-get-em, rough-and-tumble tomboy type, but which is really far more mundane for its sameness, not only to the other characters in this film, but to any given female lead of this generation. Wendy has to go on to serve as the moral center of this story, the educator of the story, but whereas in 53 she was always going to do that, and that potential both excites and dooms Peter's attachment to her, in this film she's really not all that different from those around her that the job falls more naturally to her than it would to anyone else. And then Peter himself, who isn't so clearly self-interested as portrayed back then. In 2023's version, he's been waiting for Wendy to say that she doesn't want to grow up, which occasions his arrival to whisk her off to Neverland for reasons. In the 53 film, he's not especially interested in her as a person at first,
Although Father says...
Girls talk too much.
Yes, girls talk to... Oh.
Well, get on with it, girl.
but he's been hanging around outside because he likes to hear her stories. The closest 2023 gets is having him say that he's enjoyed hearing stories about himself, which establishes a kind of narcissism, but in 53, he's been enticed by the magic of her stories, which better conveys his essential and unending childishness. When, in the animated film, she explains to him what a mother is, the only part of her description that interests him is the telling of stories, which prompts him to anoint her the lost boy's mother.
Tonight's my last night in the nursery.
But that means no more stories. No, I won't have it.
He hasn't arrived with any preconceived notions about saving her from maturity. Rather, he's shocked to learn that she has to grow up and leave the nursery the next day, so he whisked her away in order to prevent that from happening, essentially in order to keep stories alive. Nothing else matters to him. And since this is essentially one big old scene comparison, both the 2003 and the 1953 films take this opportunity to do a bit of mechanical foreshadowing. In 2003, on being taught how to fly, by that combination of happy thoughts and pixie dust, the children rise and fall according to how mature their thinking is. They let go what little maturity they have and they rise. They demonstrate comparative maturity in worrying about consequences and they fall, which is a nice little touch. While in 53, a similar tension is at play, though it's less mechanical and obvious. When Peter invites Wendy to Neverland, she turns away, fussing about all the things she needs to do to prepare for her voyage. That's her maturity at play, and her want to leave notes for her parents and get her affairs in order before she leaves, only for her then to turn around and return to Peter for nothing more than the magical possibilities of Neverland. Possibilities which entail her abandoning those mature thoughts, that sense of obligation and responsibility. She's also clearly attracted to Peter in a way that is not reciprocal, and that isn't reciprocal because she's more mature than he is. She's enticed, she wants to kiss him, which accordingly sparks Tinkerbell's jealousy, and which Peter shies away from. Because girls are icky.
What's the pixie doing?
Talking?
What did she say?
She says you're a big ugly girl.
Oh.
While in the 2023 film, Wendy accidentally pricks Peter with the needle while sewing his shadow to him, prompting one of the brothers to say that kisses make things better. Peter doesn't know what kisses are, but he isn't moved either way by the idea. Tinkerbell doesn't give a shit, meaning there's no tinge of regret or resistance when she sprays pixie dust over Wendy to enable her to fly, and Wendy doesn't want to kiss Peter. The thimble is an excuse, whereas in previous iterations going back to J.M. Barrie's original, it's symbolic. Wendy wishes she could kiss Peter, but she feels that she can't, so the thimble represents her proto-romantic attachments, while Peter is too young to understand romance, treating it as a mere trinket. Love is the reward of maturity and frivolity is the price of childhood. The point of all which is to show that, yes, there's a superficial Peter Pan-ness about all of this, but the 2023 film has already overlooked several pages worth of character premises and development and meaning and significance, and so it's reduced a number of important setups to mere trivialities. Every missed setup is at least one missed payoff later, and several of these missed setups are symbolically pivotal to the original story, meaning that their absence is going to scale as the film progresses. We move to the learning to fly sequence, and this does set up what is probably the film's best payoff. Wendy's happy thoughts are all past tense, memories of happy times in her childhood, which is well worth remembering for the parallel scene toward the close of the film. It's going to be hard to remember because it doesn't come up again in the intervening, but make a note of it, it's probably the only bit of the script that could be called rewarding. So off they fly to Neverland, which in this telling involves doing the time warp through Big Ben. Wendy is immediately brilliant at all the flying business, of course. The 53 film, by contrast, portrays it more as a Pied Piper scene and devotes roughly equal screen time to the three darlings, while the 2003 version takes the time to have Peter save Wendy from flying into a chimney, which version I slightly prefer. Wendy then does a Ray Palpatine in the mirror, and that's our scene transition, a few more vaguely pretty visuals, and we arrive in Neverland. The only thing really noteworthy about the travel and arrival sequences is that both live-action films have actually gone out of their way to be more visually creative in a more limited medium than the 53 animated film. This one gives us the time warp, and the 2003 film decides that interstellar travel has to be involved for some reason, while their progenitor actually gives us our first real glimpse of Neverland through the eyes of the pirates. We see them watching the children get their first look at this magical place, which is understated and much more efficient. Peter Pan and Wendy does cut to the pirates at roughly the same part of the sequence, but it feels compelled to elongate the setup with pretty visuals first, which ironically leaves less to the imagination in adapting a work that was deliberately scarce in detail in order that our imaginations be allowed to fill in gaps. James Barrie's version is incredibly light on certain visual details, including Peter Pan's appearance, understanding that sometimes less is more. The usual response is that, well, film's a visual medium, so you can't do that. But that's one of the reasons I'm using so many comparisons, because the 53 film did adapt this approach in a way that neither of the live-action films chose to, despite animation having far greater potential for visual wonder. On then to the pirates. The pirates have always boasted two iconic characters, Hook and Smee. Hook stands out more for clear and obvious reasons, and tends to bring out something in writers and actors alike. Dustin Hoffman has an iconic turn in the role, made so because he's given some pretty fine lines to work with, and Jason Isaacs throws plenty into a less well-written version in the 2003 film. But Smee was pivotal in the 53 original, and to the extent subsequent Hooks have been less than perfect, it's usually because the writers of the live-action films haven't done quite as good a job with Smee. Smee provides the ideal foil, being the pirate who is so unsuited to the task of pirating, whose haplessness and occasional good-naturedness brings out much more from Hook's character than you'd get if Smee were not there. A lot of the comedy that underpins the original film's success originates here, and it would be impossible in a straight revenge tale, or were Hook never distracted from his revenge quest by his bumbling sidekick. The 2023 film understands this in principle, and not coincidentally, Jude Law brings more character to the role than almost everyone else in the film combined. But even this feels stilted, and that's largely because Smee doesn't provide the same pleasant bumbling incompetence as previous iterations have been defined by. Here, he's just a bit too tall, too self-assured, he's played a bit too straight, he's not present enough, he's not comedic enough. The film understands vaguely that he's supposed to be a bit of a misfit on the crew, but whereas his earlier depictions gave him greater emotional intelligence than the rest of the crew at the expense of his practical wisdom, this film has settled for him being simply older and occasionally slightly brighter than his fellows, coupled with Law's Hook being more muted in his villainy, less dashing, less flamboyant in his own right, with less emotional range. This means the characters playing off of each other are too close to begin with to achieve the kind of contrast that previous adaptations managed. Now then, I trust you'll recall the point I made earlier about missed setups precluding payoffs and essentially hollowing out the film. Well, here's one pretty important example. Tinkerbell's absent jealousy means that this film can't find an excuse for her to trick the Lost Boys into shooting Wendy down. That's a hugely important part of the original, and it's a fairly important part of the 2003 film, and it continues to be important throughout both. It's integral to Tinkerbell's character and role in the story. She's described as being so small that she only has room for one emotion at a time, such that her jealousy leaves no room for compassion or kindness. It's that jealousy that motivates her attempted assassination of Wendy because she cannot abide another girl being anywhere near Peter. But that is entirely absent from this film, so instead, and much more tediously, it's Hook who's responsible for shooting Wendy down, leading to her separation from Peter and her brothers, and her eventual discovery by the lost... Well, they're not really lost boys in this iteration, are they? This film seems to think that the fact half the lost boys are lost girls doesn't matter, and we know that because it tells us that overtly.
But you're not all boys.
So?
But I guess it doesn't really matter.
Except that to understand why the film falls so far beneath the others, it absolutely does matter. It's almost certainly responsible for the decision to, in effect, neuter Tinkerbell as a character, which has then removed one important moral and emotional agent from the script. But it also matters because it impacts Peter's character in a not dissimilar way. Tiger Lily, of course, is a girl, and a girl of about Wendy's age, but she's from Neverland, not from the real world. In this film, she's the implied semi-leader of the Lost Boys while she's present, while previously she's been portrayed as friendly to but separate from them. Here, all the Lost Not Boys are already familiar with Wendy because in this telling, Peter went out specifically to fetch her, and they all know her as the keeper of stories, which is a half-hearted and superficial attempt to make this story resemble its forebears. But a substantial part of the plot of the earlier versions hinges not just on Peter's eternal youth, but on his eternal youth as a boy and what that means for the girls around him. It's what makes him equal parts fearful and admiring of Wendy, and alien to feminine concepts like motherhood. It's what enables Tinkerbell's pivotal jealousy, because she's previously had no rivals for Peter's affection, a dynamic that almost mirrors Wendy, given the boy isn't actually capable of that sort of affection. Because girls grow up faster than boys do, and they think about these things long before boys ever become aware of them. Tiger Lily in the original arguably serves to foreshadow Wendy as well. Barry describes her as beautiful, and also, I believe, in love with Peter, who once again does not reciprocate because he never does, because he can't, because he is quite specifically an eternally young boy. Boys and girls are different. I know, sue me for a hate crime. And that difference is quite exclusionary until you reach a certain age. Anyone who has ever been a boy or a girl knows this. Anyone who remembers primary school knows this. And it informs Barry's original character work with Peter and Wendy. Older versions of Peter Pan explain the total absence of lost girls by saying that girls are far too clever to fall out of their perambulators in the first place, which is the slightly comic reason the lost boys become lost to begin with. This essential differentness is what gives motives of jealousy and resentment to at least 2 and arguably 3 characters in the older works. Tinkerbell, jealous of Peter's attention to Wendy. Wendy, jealous when Tiger Lily flirts with Peter, and I believe it's also implied at least that Tiger Lily, who has been saving herself futilely for Peter, is also jealous of Wendy, at least in some versions. To all of which the boy is, for the most part, blissfully and painfully ignorant. And this has substantial and meaningful and quite tragic implications throughout the story and especially for the end of the story, but we will come to that in due course. For now, the film's stubborn insistence on updating the story for modern audiences has, as so often, worked against depth of character and narrative. Saying boys and girls are different might sound like a simplistic explanation, but pretending that isn't so has robbed the story of much of its depth, and of much of its variety, because the consequences of simple differentness multiply exponentially. At the very basic level, you have the feeling of unrequited love in Wendy, Tinkerbell, and Tiger Lily, which in the first and third case has to be overcome as part of growing up. On another level, you actually have more of a girl's perspective in the older works, not only of unrequited love, of bewilderment and even frustration at the childishness of boys your own age, but also their perceived callousness. Tinkerbell adores Peter, but Peter banishes her for her attempts to take down Wendy, despite how precious she believes herself to be. And on yet a third level, you have the sacrifice entailed by Peter's eternal youth, because he will never be old enough for deep attachments to form. That simple differentness is what imbues the older versions of the story with darker and definitely tragic, mournful and regretful undertones, making for a more emotionally rich and complex story than 2023 even tries to give us. I've got no problems with the other recastings, by the way. The films clearly had various quotas to meet, but multicultural Lost Boys don't harm the story, and arguably improve it in this one rare instance by broadening the scope of the place and of the magic that brings Lost Boys to Neverland to begin with. The change in setup does provide the 2023 film with a simpler and more easily graspable set of stakes. Rather than the pirates capturing Tiger Lily in a bid to find out Peter's location, here they captured the Darling brothers, which introduces Hook's fear of the ticking clock. One of the Darling brothers has a pocket watch, which Hook smashes. The one to rescue Wendy's brothers is undeniably quicker as a surrogate for the kidnapping of Tiger Lily in the older works, but somehow, despite taking this ostensibly more efficient route, the film has still ended up almost twice as long as the thing it's abridging. And you can also be reasonably sure the switch was made in part to avoid the apparent sin of rescuing a damsel in distress. The actress playing Tiger Lily has said that this version finally does justice to the character, which betrays a typical arrogance. Tiger Lily will end up much more important to the plot of the older works than she is in this one. She'll provide more motive than she does in this one. She'll form more characters than she does in this one. And she will add more to the world than she does in this one. But hey, at least she spends more time in front of the camera in this one. At least she does more fighting. At least she gets some slow-mo hero shots. So I guess we can all be happy because this is what character means in 2023. The simplicity of this version sees Hook capture the Darling brothers in the expectation that Peter Pan will come out to save them, while in earlier versions, he captures Tiger Lily in the hope she'll disclose Peter's location, which plan eventually leads to his playing on Tinkerbell's jealousy to extract that same information once Tiger Lily has been rescued. That, of course, cannot happen this time. Here, Peter disguises himself as one of the pirates, causes havoc, acts appallingly again, offs most of the pirates, and then confronts Hook. He doesn't have much trouble against him until he gets distracted by Wendy, and Hook takes advantage and takes out Peter via his shadow. This occasions one of Peter's more haunting lines.
Strike then, if you've got the courage. For to die would be an awfully big adventure.
But whereas the 2003 film placed this at the end point of a climactic battle,
now, Peter Pan, you shall die.
To die will be an awfully big adventure.
And Barry's original places it in a moment of uncharacteristic self-sacrifice, Peter seemingly giving up his own life to save Wendy and overcoming his first experience of fear. By contrast, this film, well, as so often, it remembered the line was in the older works, so it figured it should probably be in this one too, but it doesn't really understand the meaning or the consequence or how to place it or what it's supposed to convey. It's yet another example of this film mirroring the flaws of its protagonist. It's flippant, it's capricious, it's concerned with trinkets, not with emotion or feeling or meaning. It's treating the set pieces and lines and characters from older works like Peter treats the shiny things he collects. Vague appreciation, a childish lack of understanding. In this telling, of course, it's Wendy who saves Peter because the year is 2023. She does this by distracting Hook before he can land the killing blow. We also get the film's first deployment of the crocodile it's hitherto not bothered to set up and subsequently will do very little with. And the crocodile in this telling has much more fun attacking the rest of the pirates than it seems to have chasing Hook, which then diminishes its own narrative role versus the older works, where it's uniquely Hook's bane. The ticking clock inside it, and its single-minded pursuit of him, is a comic rendition of the Grim Reaper mechanic, something natural and preternatural, producing that unique fear, that unique vulnerability in Hook. He's racing to kill Peter because he's running from death, while in this film he wants to kill Peter, but the crocodile is just occasionally around as an environmental hazard. Reunited, the children bugger off for whatever else the plot has in store for them, because this simplistic retelling has actually created gaps in the narrative where nothing really happens, while the older works ensured that the story had a couple of interwoven threads, ensuring that nothing was ever truly still and everyone always had somewhere to be. This film takes the stillness as a chance to have Wendy and Tiger Lily interact, Tiger Lily imparting some vague mystical bullshit that's supposed to sound wise, and Wendy pointlessly pondering about where her home truly is. Had the film bothered to establish that Tiger Lily has feelings for Peter that are unrequited, then maybe she could have given some mournful and regretful advice to Wendy in this scene, but the film has eschewed romance almost entirely. So, notably absent from their minds is Peter himself, which is another departure from and diminishment of the older works. Peter Pan and Wendy doesn't seem to understand that Wendy is and always was the moral center of the story, but Peter was always proximate, the focus in Wendy's mind, and the representative of her potential non-future. She has to get over him to get over Neverland, to mature, which can't happen without a preceding obsession that the older film showed but this film hasn't. Because this film thinks that for the story to be about Wendy, she must always be at the center of it, and everyone else, including Peter, mostly peripheral. Everyone basically likes her, including Tiger Lily. the writers seemingly so keen to avoid falling foul of the Bechdel test that they've missed an important opportunity for strife and development through conflict. Tiger Lily leaves Wendy at the entrance to the Lost Boys' lair, where Wendy is asked to read bedtime stories to the children. Here the film is on stronger footing, because it more accurately recalls the earlier work's Peter-Wendy dichotomy. Wendy asks Peter to tell a story and is surprised and disappointed at how simple his recollection is, at how little thought he pays to anything beyond the moment. He's angry and threatened by her questioning, and by the response it gets from the Lost Boys, who are more curious than he is, and who are shown to place more care on history and memory. It's not quite so fulsome a depiction as those earlier works, because the difference between them isn't shown to have any deeper motive than Wendy being older and more responsible than the rest of them, which is an important part of her character, to be sure, but which so far omits the why question that Barry answered quite conclusively, and which the 53 film also recognised.
Hard! But you can't. You need a mother. We all do. Well, a mother, a real mother, is the most wonderful person in the world.
Wendy can be our mother.
Goodness, no. I don't even know if I want to be a mother.
I mean, this is sort of tied into it, because people often think that Peter Pan is a story simply about eternal youth. It's not. It's about eternal boyhood, very specifically eternal boyhood. The whole dramatic contrast between Wendy and Peter is that Wendy she's on the cusp of adulthood. She's not that much older in terms of numbers than Peter is, but girls mature much more quickly. In Barry's version, he actually has a line explaining that the reason there are no lost girls is that girls are too clever to fall out of their perambulators, which is the reason that boys end up in Neverland. They're silly, they fall out of their prams, and they get whisked away because they're fundamentally unserious, frivolous little shits. There's an essential difference between boys and girls that underpins the entire thing, and it plays up the women's perspective all throughout. And this new adaptation, which is ostensibly trying to put Wendy further to the fore, has completely missed the point that she was always the moral author of that story. She was always the one who grew up to give moral lessons. She's the example by which to lead. She's the one who gives educational value. She's the one who grows up. She's the one who we actually are supposed to embody, as opposed to idolize. And she has to overcome her sort of naivety and her desire for eternal youth by overcoming Peter and what he represents, which she does in part because she realizes, as a boy, he's basically an idiot at this age. And so, all of her romantic aspirations, which she has for him, are fruitless. And there's a number of other characters. Tinkerbell is romantically attached to Peter, and he banishes her without a moment's thought because she's jealous of Wendy and tries to get her killed. There's Tiger Lily, the Indian princess, who also has this sort of forlorn love with Peter. She's saving herself for him, but he'll never grow up, so he'll never repay that. So this essential difference between boys and girls is integral to the story. But it also, not only does it portray girls as being more mature and more sensible, it also, in the original and in the Disney version, it really does extol the virtues of what women can grow up to be. So Wendy has a speech in the original when she's tired of Peter. He's embarrassed her and he's let her down. And so she says to her young brothers, no, we're going home tomorrow. And they say, no, we're staying. And she says, no, you need parents, you need a mother. And they say, well, you can be our mother. She says, well, I can't be a mother. And then all the Lost Boys realize that they kind of remember having a mother, but they don't remember what one is. And so she gives a long sort of soliloquy about what a mother is. A mother is the most bright, the most brilliant person. She's the person who sings you to bed at night. She's the person who gives you lullaby. She's the person who kisses your cheek and rubs the dirt off your knees and all the rest of that. And it's really lovely. And she sings a little song about the virtues of motherhood. Compare it to 2023, when reducing women to motherhood is reducing women. And the entire line is reduced to, I'm not your mother. I don't even know if I want to be a mother. And that's it. And then you think that you have no conception of what the story's about, do you? You think that for a woman to be the front and center of the story, she has to wield the sword and beat the bad guy and punch people in the face and be unspeakably generic and unmemorable. And you have no conception of what the moral point of the story you're telling is, or why there are different ways of ennobling men and women. And that the women come out far better from Peter Pan than the boys do. But no, we have to reduce them to the same thing. Peter then goes upstairs and slams the door in a huff, and Wendy sings the children a lullaby. And because it's now time for the plot to move along, this is overheard not only by Peter, but also by Hook and the surviving pirates who are conveniently in the vicinity. Meanwhile, Tinkerbell and Wendy make friends. They bond over the fact that Peter doesn't listen to either of them, which is just shit for the reasons previously stated. It's a common theme when writers try to pass the Bechdel test. The side effect of removing boys from the wants of girls is that the girls then have very little to say to each other that isn't just mutually aggrandizing. You're the best. No, you're the best. Yes, but you're the prettiest. No, but you're so pretty. The patriarchy sucks. Yeah, isn't it terrible? It's cringy, it's perfumed, inconsequential bilge of the type you would never put into the mouth of a male character because it's tacitly accepted, if imperfectly understood, that boys don't need this kind of thing because they are actually interesting for what they do and how they think. Girls can be just as interesting, but not when you write them like this. Wendy jealous of Tiger Lily is far more interesting than Wendy swapping congratulatory remarks and boilerplate encouragement with someone who has instantly become her best friend. Tinkerbell is far more interesting when she tries to have Wendy killed than when they're sympathizing with each other at being ignored by the menfolk. Just man up a bit, gals. This brief sympathy wank is the prelude to our discovery that Hook used to live in this lair and be friends with Peter, though not before we get some unsubstantiated quibbling between Peter and Wendy. Wendy finds him on the roof and Peter laments. He says he thought that they would be friends instead of always fighting, even though they've had barely one fight at this point and none of this has actually been set up or established. Wendy joins the dots and Peter admits that Hook was once his best friend, the first lost boy, but he left Neverland and abandoned Peter and came back changed. This isn't terrible stuff, it's not delivering anything yet, but it is setting up potential that the film will have to, and so probably won't, take up. Peter characterizes Hook as returning cruel and evil, and Wendy suggests that he'd just grown up. Peter doesn't recognize any difference in that distinction. The film, I think, is drawing inspiration from, or rather lifting the premise, from Christina Henry's 2017 novel, The Lost Boy, which I could pretend I've read, but won't. I know there are those who'll sniff at this kind of embellishment, who insist that sometimes stories are better left without origins. But my boring answer is always going to be, it depends. This film seems to have the right intent. It's the first example I'm aware of where it's attempting to add something to the story as opposed to merely repeating it with the most important aspects removed. It uses this revelation to drive home Peter's fear of the outside world, his fear of losing people, because he's lost his best friend once and he came back different, something he's terrified will happen to Wendy. And that's all serviceable stuff, though it does pose some difficult questions. For example, if Hook has this history, if he's been here before, if he was Peter's best friend before, if he used to live here, why the quivering fuck didn't he reason that this would be the best place to look for Peter? And, unfortunately, adding stuff here can't distract from what's been taken away elsewhere, and so this exchange prompts Wendy's first voiced doubts about Neverland, which she's found makes her unhappy. This is a clunky and abridged attempt to force what in the original developed over time. She hasn't really been here at all, or at any rate not for long, and these doubts haven't had any time to formulate or grow in this version. And then the conversation just kind of ends, which feels distinctly truncated. It's Peter who turns away and bids Wendy goodnight, which is jarring when you consider that he's the one trying to convince her to stay in this place. Downstairs, inevitably, the pirates have broken in and kidnapped the Lost Boys, and they capture Wendy as well. Hook goes upstairs to find Peter, but Peter hears him coming and he hides. There's a payoff of sorts to the earlier information, Hook recounting their countless games of hide and seek and how he was always the best at finding Peter. Peter drops down, Hook swipes at him, and for questionable reasons this causes Peter to fall down the tower, having forgotten that he can fly, to hit the floor rather hard, while Tinkerbell, in a bid to save him, gets captured. In the minds of our characters, this is surely the end of the story, no? Or it should be. Naturally, of course, Hook doesn't think it worth making doubly sure that Peter is dead, and it's not yet apparent why he really has this motive to begin with, or indeed what this really means to him. Questions that don't need to arise unless you accept the need for a backstory, in which case we really do need answers at some point. Answers specifically that can explain why he's so single-minded and vengeful, but not single-minded and vengeful enough to make sure he's finished the job. Answers, too, that might give some hint as to what he plans to do next, since we can't help but note that the film isn't over, and we don't really have a sense of what Hook has accomplished here. Despite the backstory, he's really not got much more depth as a character than the original cartoonish version. What the script has accomplished, and it is a dubious accomplishment, is to replace the beat in the original, and in the 53 film, and in the 03 film, that sees Tinkerbell betray Peter and then redeem herself by saving him. Because she's little more than Navi from Ocarina of Time in this version, just kind of there, occasionally helping move the plot along but without really being a character in her own right, instead of betraying Peter's location to Hook in a fit of jealousy, here Hook just conveniently overheard Wendy singing, and so finds his way back to a place he had absolutely no reason to have forgotten about in the first place. He kills Peter, he captures Tinkerbell, who can't save Peter, and indeed who has no redemptive need to save him. What we have instead is Peter's shadow becoming relevant again, because that's just what the script demands, I guess, and going off to Tiger Lily for help. She rides off to save Peter, paying off absolutely nothing whatsoever. Tiger Lily ex machina as far as the writers are concerned. Hook brings Wendy and the lost children aboard his ship, where he keeps them captive because he vaguely remembers hearing Wendy's lullaby in another life, and it makes him feel things. We learn from Hook that Peter exiled him from Neverland, and a cursory Google search informs me that this has been a fan theory for a while. Peter banished him because he missed his parents, which works on some levels but not on others, and could have been made to work on a much better level had the film played up Wendy's role as mother to the lost boys previously. But the film is cautious about casting Wendy in an overt motherly role. It explicitly has her point out that she doesn't even know if she wants to be one, which you can compare to the 53 films extolling of the virtues of motherhood. But hey, we can't be reducing our female heroes to motherhood anymore. That's far too old-fashioned. Hook's own motives are likewise hazy and confused, because he explains that he left, but he couldn't get home, and was picked up and raised by pirates, whom he eventually came to lead, and he led them back to Neverland, because Peter was his friend and he'd been happy here, even though being unhappy here was the reason he left to begin with. The film gives Wendy one of its stronger lines in this scene, as Hook explains he's lost all chance for happiness and menacingly tells her that he is what growing up looks like, to which she responds, "No, this is what happens when you grow up wrong," which is fine in isolation, except, again, we've not really had any sense of Wendy's evolving understanding of what growing up entails. She feared it before she came to Neverland. She randomly decided she wasn't happy here, and so she wants to go home. But there's not been much to explain A, why that's so to begin with, or B, that she's taken some lesson from this about the merits of adulthood, and formed equivalent ideals about it. Again, the comparison is to the original, where growing up is the logical outgrowth of a character Wendy comes in with, versus this film, where growing up is a pivot from her initial characterization that the film hasn't really tried to flesh out, if you can flesh out a pivot. Anyway, this prompts Hook to demand all the children be executed. Reasons, I guess. Wendy tries to persuade him to take her instead of the children, because the children can grow up to become good pirates if he gives them the chance. I mean, it wasn't immediately clear that she wasn't destined to be killed with them anyway, but she's taken up first either way. Meanwhile, Tiger Lily uses some magical bullshit herbs to bring Peter Pan back to life, fulfilling all the promise of no setup whatsoever, but Peter can't fly anymore, so she has to help him up. Someone remind me whose story this is? Wendy slowly walks the plank to a rousing sea shanty, but as she falls off, she has a series of flashes forward, which is a superficially clever version of her happy thoughts flashbacks from the beginning of the film. Clever because it solidifies her change in outlook from the past to the future, but superficial because, again, this has been only partially, at best, set up throughout the film. The transition from memory to prospect is certainly an interesting one, because the idea that childhood happiness is in the past tense, which is how the film began, is an adult's view of childhood, not a child's self-reflection. Wendy only thinks backward because she's already nearly an adult. I get the impression this was the writer's thought process. In other words, Wendy being on the cusp of adulthood makes her able to look both back and forward. Back with a mature yearning for her simple days, but forward as only an adult can. And so the choice she makes is placed at the midpoint of her past and future thoughts, and if that is what they intended, that's not bad, conceptually. It's just a bit of a shame the film between these two scenes, which is to say, pretty much all of it between these two scenes, didn't do very much to tie these bits together. Tinkerbell also chooses this moment to remember that she can escape, and the pirates realize they didn't hear a splash. The entire ship becomes infused with pixie dust. Wendy rises from the water to deliver perhaps the film's most cringy line.
You have the boy's magic.
No, this magic belongs to no boy.
Give me a second while I look up my little file of things I really don't give a fuck about. Yes, she's still there.
The entire ship begins to fly, and Peter is carried back into the scene by Tiger Lily. You can tell it's been struggling with its own messaging most of the way through, in other words, struggling to keep its messaging in check. And it's actually done a surprisingly good job of keeping messaging out for the most part, though always with a deep sense of regret, and the film has never struck a more triumphant tone than when it gives one of the gals a moment to shine, which has the effect of reducing Peter to a passenger in the film for the most part, and quite literally in this scene. Still, if your biggest worry going into it was quote-unquote woke garbage, you'll probably not be as pissed off by that aspect as you might have expected, not until this point anyway. The rest of it is disappointing for entirely separate reasons, and its very occasional girl boss moments are really just a little cherry of shit on top of a bland and boring cake. There is, of course, an unrealized contradiction in Peter's invocation of a bit of help from my friends when he explains his survival to Hook, the friend he betrayed and banished and cast out. The film doesn't seem to have noticed this yet, but Peter has become kind of the villain of the piece, which was always the risk in attempting to give he and Hook some sort of backstory. There's a difference between a dangerous and stifling naivety, as in the older works, and actual cold, heartless indifference to suffering, which is what the film has effectively given him. This being 2023, the most impressive parts of the resulting fight have nothing to do with Peter and Hook, and instead see the girls beating the shit out of all comers.
To the top, push it to the edge, give it all you got, barely break a sweat, strong woman, strong woman, strong. Yeah, she's got speed, she's got the move, she's got the muscle and a whole lot to prove, strong woman, strong.
The Darling brothers get perhaps one scene, which reminds me how inconsequential they've been throughout the film. They briefly pilot the flying ship away from a cliff it's been heading toward, though even this is only an excuse to have Wendy rescue them from a pirate who inexplicably decides the wheel is the most important thing of all. They then cower behind Tiger Lily for the remainder while Wendy pilots the ship, and Tiger Lily takes out the big bad, enjoying the odd actual slow-mo hero shot in case we weren't sufficiently aware of how awesome she is and cringing at it. And now the film has basically given up all pretense. We get Peter falling out of a now upside-down ship to be rescued again by a decidedly patronizing Wendy, who at least has the decency to share some of her pixie dust with him so he can fly again. The girls having bossed their way through the fight, Peter and Hook finally come to the fore for the first time in the film. Peter bests Hook, who does a reasonable job of putting a spin on their eternal fight, telling Peter that the point of it is that it is eternal.
Without you, the fire that fuels me will go out.
And that this place, and neither of them, would be the same without it. Peter decides that he has the bare bones of a character, and characters should probably show at least some sort of development at some point, so in response, he throws down his sword and apologizes to Hook for being a dick, and exiling him, ruining his life, and turning him into an evil, bitter old man. And then, Wendy saves Peter again, as Hook strikes at him anyway. She tells Hook to grow up. This is all very silly. What's marginally better is that when Hook falls and Peter grabs him, Peter tries to teach him to fly by telling him to remember happy thoughts. And Hook has the shock of recognition. He doesn't have any.
Think happy thoughts.
Peter, I haven't got any.
And his hook falls off and he drops into the sea. That was not a terrible scene. It's just a shame that the film will go on to do less than nothing with it. This makes Peter sad, because he's decided that they were friends after all. But before this can actually impact the film or his character overmuch, Wendy intrudes to say, essentially, fuck that guy, we need to go home. And Peter says, are you okay, I guess? So, that's a staggering waste of a potentially brilliant scene. By the laws of the film, too, I think it means that Wendy is responsible for Peter regressing to his eternal youth, since he was about to have a moment of fulfilled realization that changes Neverland, representing his growing up, understanding the consequences of his childish actions. And she stopped it, because she was bored and she wants to go home. The fuck are you doing, film? The ship flies off, and Wendy returns home to apologize to her mother and admit that she's now ready to grow. All the lost children are in her bedroom, and much like the earlier works, they get adopted by the Darlings. Peter, though, is crying on the roof. Wendy asks why. He points to the chimney, where the words Peter Pan are scrawled. I'm gonna have to channel a drinker and say, fuck off, film, we didn't need this. This is a very good example of the merits of leaving things unsaid. Wendy reasons that this is the reason he kept coming back, Not for his love of her stories, or because he wanted her particularly, despite these very much being his motives until precisely this moment. No, he used to live here. He just went off to Neverland like any other boy, which effectively destroys Peter Pan's entire purpose in the story. He's not supposed to be just any other lost boy. He's supposed to be the personification of childhood. If you reduce him to this mundane, practical explanation, what is the fucking point in him? What are we learning from him anymore? He gives then what sounds like a staggeringly ignorant meta comment about how his story never has an ending, until now.
I'm just a story. A story told to any child who'd listen. It never had an ending, until now.
Wendy offers him the chance to stay with her and grow up. Thankfully, and it really is thankfully, he says, nah, he's not ready, and he and Tinkerbell board the flying ship and they return to Neverland. Tinkerbell pausing to thank Wendy for hearing her. Slow clap, I guess, thus making us wonder what precisely is her motive for staying with Peter, given the film has deliberately avoided the unrequited romance between them. Wendy scrawls her name between Peter's on the chimney, though quite what her attachment to him at this point is supposed to be is likewise unclear. She's never seemed especially fond of him right from the word go, because, and once again, the film deliberately avoided the unrequited romance between them and didn't even do much to make him the personification of Neverland and eternal youth in her mind, which was kind of the point of these characters to begin with. He's supposed to represent something that she finds tantalizing, not something that briefly appeals to her, only for her to say, you know what, nah, fuck it, I'm going home. Peter and Tink sail away on the ship. Back in Neverland, we see that Hook and Smee survived, and they look up and they see the ship return, and Hook smiles. Though quite what his attachment to Peter is at this point is supposed to be is likewise unclear, since when we last saw them, Hook had rejected Peter's apology, and then plopped into the water because he realized he had no happy memories. Because of Peter, remember? Because Peter in this film is in fact a little shit. There follows nearly 15 minutes of credits with no mid or post-credit scene, which affords me the time to tell you how the story is supposed to end. Because that is a very handy way of demonstrating how empty this film is next to its source material, how shallow, how blasé, how thoughtless. In the 53 animated film, the Lost Boys decide they'd all return to Neverland, then stay and be adopted in London. And having been in London recently, I can confirm they made the right decision. Over time, Wendy's father has relaxed. He's become less stern with her. He realizes perhaps he was a little too strict. He's willing to make a compromise. Grow up, yes, but don't grow up too fast. When she tells him about her adventures, he looks out of the window. He sees the flying pirate ship, and he remembers it from when he was a child.
You know, I have the strangest feeling that I've seen that ship before. A long time ago.
The 53 film strikes a charming, heartwarming balance between the want to remain young and the need to grow up, while showing the lessons adults have for children shouldn't come at the expense of their own happy memories. All adults were children once. And that's a nice, thoughtful, charming little ending. Barry's original pans out. Oh look, it's a pun. It pans out rather differently. In the play, in the novelization, Peter is darker, and much more of what we might politely call a dick, but in a way that actually aids the moral of the story, as opposed to confusing it, which is what this film does. He agrees to sail the ship back to London, but then flies ahead and bars the window to Wendy's room, in a bit to trick her into thinking her mother has moved on and forgotten about her, until he sees Wendy's mother crying for the loss of her daughter, which prompts him with much resentment and bitterness to leave the window open. The parents adopt the Lost Boys, but Peter refuses to join them. It's suggested that Wendy's mother recognizes him too, and that she knew him when she was a child, and that she suffers some sort of loss when he leaves again, or a bittersweet feeling at the very least. Peter promises to take Wendy back to Neverland once a year for spring cleaning, but the next time she goes with him, she finds he's forgotten almost everything about their past adventures. He's forgotten Tinkerbell, despite her devotion, she died unremembered. He's forgotten Hook, despite their epic duels. He's forgotten the Lost Boys, despite gathering them in the first place and keeping them from their parents. He's forgotten why Wendy ever wanted to return home, and all about her want to grow up. This eternal recurrence of unchanging Peter prompted J.M. Barrie to write for the play's narrator the inversion of Peter Pan's line about dying. The reworked line goes, "To live would be an awfully big adventure," the implication being that though eternally happy, Peter isn't really alive, or experiencing life as we would understand it. He's missing out on the depth of experience. Barry then wrote an epilogue in the novelized version that has Peter returning years later to find Wendy grown up and married. To her, he was away for years. To him, it seems like it was only yesterday. After his initial outrage at her perceived betrayal, and indeed her partial regret at being unable to go with him again, he ends up taking her daughter to Neverland instead. And then, later, her granddaughter. All presumably to be forgotten about at some point, just like everyone else he meets and who cares for him. On the one hand, eternal innocence, though the corollary implication is eternal loss. And more even than that, a state of never having anything to begin with, never anything but fun, which when you really think about it, makes the story at least as tragic as it is endearing. What the older works were was undeniably magical in the good old-fashioned sense. That's more than soft and cheerful stuff, it's a proper fairy tale, quite dark in places. Barry's original combined that magic and the yearning for it with astute observations about his characters and the trade-off struck with time. You can have happiness in an eternal present at the expense of progress, love, memory, real attachment. Or you can have progress that entails difficulty, challenge, and loss, but also love and meaning and memory. Happy memories can be sad things, nostalgic things, but they are worth having all the more for that. If his ultimate goal was to encourage a difficult but fulfilling compromise that reminds adults of their childhood and children of the need to grow up, then the 53 and even the 2003 films captured Barry's intent in their own ways. The 2023 film was at best only dimly aware of all of this, and never bothered to grapple with it conceptually or to really interrogate how it should manifest in its characters, who were shorn of all the work done in previous iterations. The absence of character saw the plot bent in new and uninteresting ways, with the exception of the backstory between Peter and Hook, which had the potential to be interesting, but that potential was never fulfilled. Wendy prevented that from happening by interrupting what should have been the most consequential scene, and then by having Peter return to Neverland to find his old friend and old enemy turn for absolutely no reason back into what we are led to believe is his friend again. It allows him to pick up things where they left off, which I'd submit is much less interesting and much less heart-rending and moving than the novel and the plays version, which has it that there is nothing for Peter to pick up because he forms no memories and has no values to begin with. Tinkerbell, as discussed, has been shorn of all meaningful agency. The Darling brothers barely feature and don't seem to have any thoughts at all about the events unfolding around them or any opinion on the merits of returning home. We never see them grow up. We never see them grow at all. They're just there because they're supposed to be there, with no further thought applied to their depiction. They barely even have character, which is a shame since the 03 and 53 films demonstrated much more of that and took way less time to do it. Peter Pan himself has been turned into something one suspects more evil than the writers were really aware of when they were penning the script, while Hook somehow emerges as less of a character despite having been given so much more backstory. The revelation that he has no happy thoughts, that this was all Peter's fault, is met with no payoff at all, which is quite staggering when you think about it. It's like there's a whole long scene missing between Peter's departure from and return to him. If one wants to be charitable, we can suggest that his smile at seeing Peter's return isn't about the reclamation of friendship, but a return to the eternal jewel that gives him purpose. But I think that would constitute doing an awful lot of work on the writer's behalf. And by cutting out the section with the Pickaninny tribe, turning Tiger Lily from important damsel in distress to generic girl boss, and so spurning any need to interact with her parents and their tribe, the film accomplished less than half the world building than the 53 film and took twice as long to do it, all in the name of female empowerment. Which is perhaps the most irritating of all the film's most irritating aspects. It couldn't grasp that Wendy has always been the moral author of the story, that she is the one who provides the lessons, that she's the one who learns, that she's the one who grows. It's as if these writers have always considered Peter Pan to be a story about Peter first and foremost, when the precise opposite is true. Peter isn't a character, not in any conventional sense. He's a symbol, he's representative. He is, as befitting his name, a state of unchanging nature that provides the foil to Wendy's forming personhood. Peter Pan was never more than an ideal, a lesson, and perhaps a warning.
But he was looking at the one joy from which he must be forever barred.
To live would be an awfully big adventure.
Charming, lively, but not really alive. The story was all about those around him, Wendy foremost, but Tinkerbell and Tiger Lily as well, for the way they represent aspects of character Peter doesn't have and cannot comprehend. Peter Pan didn't need to be updated to center the women in his story, as this film clumsily tries to do. Peter Pan was always about the girls, about their instincts, about their wants and desires, about their intelligence versus the boys who are too silly to grow up. Compare Wendy, Tinkerbell and Tiger Lily in this film to the novel's depiction or the 53 film or even the 2003 film, and tell me which does more justice to the fairer sex. The swashbuckling, sword-fighting, all-action girl boss of modernity or the characters of the bygone age. I know which teaches me more, and I'm just a stupid boy. I highly doubt that this is going to be the worst live-action remake on our screens this year. Hell, it's not likely to be the worst live-action remake for more than a couple of months, once this monstrosity emerges from the water to take its crown. But it is a very useful answer to the question, why? Why are these live-action remakes so bad? The answer is that these screenwriters don't especially know Peter Pan, or his origins, or Barry's thoughts and wider writings. They don't especially care to understand what made it successful to begin with. They don't understand the difference between magic and character. All they know is that the original was incredibly successful, and successful things of the past can be dollarized in the present. J.M. Barrie could have never been recognized, yet Peter Pan would still have been written as a labor of love for the children he adopted. He wrote for their enjoyment and to teach them things, and to reflect on his relationship with them and on his own deeply troubled childhood. He wrote it with a purpose preceding and much more powerful than that which caused them to be remade in 2023. Without money, Peter Pan the original would still exist. Without money, Disney Plus's Peter Pan and Wendy wouldn't even have been considered. Your love of magic has to come before your love of money. Without the former, you'll end up like modern-day Disney, lacking both.